We are meeting at a moment where we are seeing significant geopolitical and economic flux in the Indo-Pacific. Across the world, we see a lot of geopolitical uncertainty is rising, economic tensions are growing, and competition between major powers is reshaping the global order. As Anthony mentioned, and even it came up in the last panel, that we need to rethink our partnerships in the region. And I think this panel will be mainly addressing those pertinent issues. I will first start with you, Tim. You're seeing that, as I mentioned, that we are in a more fragmented and contested geopolitical and economic setting at the moment. From Australia's perspective, how are these shifts reshaping the strategic thinking in the Indo-Pacific? And where do you see India fitting into that entire broad Australia strategic thinking when it's dealing with these shifts in the region?
So it's interesting. I don't think that Australia's strategic thinking is changing. I think that the context in which that thinking and the way we're acting in the region is rapidly changing. Our region is becoming both more consequential and more complex. But the fundamental approach of the Australian government to that change remains unchanged. We want to see an Indo-Pacific region that's peaceful, prosperous and secure, governed by rules, norms, international law, but importantly, a region where countries are free to make their own choices, where sovereignty is respected, where agency is respected. Now, agency of individual countries to make their own choices. So there's a lot of change going on, but that guiding strategic outlook hasn't changed. Now, obviously, a region that works like that won't just build itself. We need to see a regional balance. We need to see countries working together to build a region that operates in that way. In that context, it's difficult to think of countries that are more important to Australia's strategic outlook than India. And one thing I'll just add to High Commissioner Green's comments, we are in a period of change, but it's worth noting the things that aren't changing. The stability in India and Australia, the stability in our strategic outlooks, the stability in our political leaderships, in the key ministerial roles, are really islands of stability in a context of change. That's a big opportunity for us to work together, I think, to shape the region. We're obviously doing so through the Quad. We do so through regional organisations like EORA, where India is currently the chair. But we also do so intensely in a bilateral sense. And it is really impossible, I think, to overstate the extent of the strategic intimacy that has developed there. I mean, Prime Minister Albanese was the first foreign leader to step onto the deck of the INS Vikrant. Deputy Prime Minister Miles was a passenger on a P8 surveillance flight from Goa to Delhi. These are things that you only do in a context of intimacy. Now, working together to shape the region in that time of change, that's a challenge. I think that there are big opportunities in maritime cooperation in the Indian Ocean. We've seen Deputy Prime Minister Miles and Defence Minister Singh initiate conversations on the maritime cooperation roadmap. I think that's of vital importance given the changes and the conflict that we've been seeing in the Middle East recently.
Thank you, Tim. And Aparna, if I can shift to you, growing from what Tim just mentioned, and when he's talking about how countries are reacting individually, but also in a way together to certain scenarios, and we know that India believes in maintaining its strategic autonomy, and as Ambassador and as High Commissioner Singh just mentioned, and we are now moving towards issue-based alignment or multi-alignment as we see it. Where do you position the India-Australia relationship in that wider Indo-Pacific context?
Thank you. Let me just start by referring to something that I call the lament for the good old days. This was the speech by Prime Minister Mark Carney at Davos, where, of course, he spoke of the end of the pleasant daydream of international order and the beginning of the harsh reality. The fact is that countries like India have lived in this harsh reality for the last 70 years. Contestation of the international order and international law has been our reality. Even as a colonized country, 100 years back, we've been trying to make our point of view known and accepted in an international order, which often did not do so. And the strategies and the principles that we have evolved have come from that historical background. So strategic autonomy for us is not a new concept. It's a deeply held, and it's a part of our foreign policy and of our national experience. Another way to look at it is what you call fragmentation, or what some countries and people call fragmentation, perhaps we call diversity. What you call hedging, perhaps we call autonomy. What you call the difference between value-based and issue-based alliances is what we have practiced so far, which is to have small, plurilateral, multilateral groupings which do not question values, which do not try and spread a particular point of view, but look at pragmatic collaboration that is possible. My submission is that it's time for countries to perhaps, many countries now are living in the world today, or are facing a world today that we have already faced for the last couple of decades. So it's necessary to look at how we can look for specific pragmatic collaboration in areas such as, for instance, let me take economic resilience. We speak a lot about decoupling. Now, the experience of the last couple of years has shown us that decoupling perhaps is easier to speak of than to implement. So let's talk about leverage. When we speak about leverage, what does it mean to say that a country or a corporate is a trusted partner? These are conversations, granular conversations, that lawyers, policymakers, and academicians have to have between our countries to move it forward from friendship to partnership. So that's the need of the hour as to how we operationalize the multipolarity and the issue-based collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you for ending on that note, and that brings me to my third question. We're talking about multipolarity, trilateral platforms. We are aware that the Quad Foreign Ministers Summit is scheduled for the end of the month, and this goes to all of you in the panel, and Lisa, to you especially. Do you think now it's time for countries like India and Australia to take the lead in pushing the Quad to a more operational platform? And we are aware that with the US's attention now shifting to the Middle East, is it time for countries like Australia and India to take that one step forward in taking the Quad to the next level?
Well, thank you so much, Premesha. And can I just say at the outset, as someone who also hosts 1.5 track dialogues, I know how stressful they are. So I have to say it's much more enjoyable being a participant than hosting. But with that, I just want to thank and acknowledge the work of the teams of Asia Society and Aspen Centre, and particularly Indrani and Anthony's leadership in pulling this together. No mean feat at all. Wonderful to be here with such an esteemed panel as well, and to be talking about the Quad again. Bringing the Quad back on the agenda, and I think that will happen, as you say, at the end of this month through the foreign ministers' meet. I think before we sort of unpack the Quad and where it's at, we need to acknowledge, and if I can steal the words of Shashi Tharoor, that the traditional separation between economics and geopolitics has collapsed. And that's really at the heart of a lot of what this dialogue is going to unpack in terms of the economic relationship. If we think about trade, supply chains, energy routes, technological ecosystems, all of it are now central arenas of strategic competition. And therein lies the challenge for the Quad. I think if we boil it down into tariffs, export controls, supply chain restrictions, these are no longer commercial tools. These are pure geopolitical leveraging that is occurring in our region, and therein lies how those Quad countries are going to grapple with this newfound reality that we're all living in. I think if we do look back, though, into not that long ago recent times of COVID, for example, where the Quad really did come to the fore, it was an example of how it can actually deliver public goods for our region through, for example, the India-led vaccine partnership that really provided that sort of stability and peace that we needed at that time. That is an area where India can continue to play a role in the Quad in strengthening and leveraging its pharmaceutical manufacturing capability. I think in terms of the US, it's going to be a challenge to continue to have climate change as a front and centre working group and agenda item for the Quad, whereas for Australia and India, it's very much front and centre. And I think our Australia-India Renewable Energy Partnership that both our Prime Ministers signed at the G20 a couple of years back is a good example of how outside of the Quad, we might need to continue to pursue some of the Quad's previous ambitions. I don't think the Quad is dead. I think it's got a challenging partner within it. But, the other three countries within the Quad, particularly including Japan, are continuing to, outside of the Quad, play a really active role. I think the Australia-India-Japan supply chain initiative is a really good example of that. So whether it's issues of, if you look at the foreign policy of both India and Australia today, some of the areas where the objectives are the same are in the fact that it does want to diversify economically. It does want that economic resilience. It does want supply chain diversification to be part of that. And it wants to assert itself as middle powers in the region, providing leadership for the global south, as India calls it. For Australia, it's through our Indo-Pacific strategy with the Pacific and Southeast Asia and the like. So there's so much both of our countries can do through the Quad, but also trilaterally and outside of it.
Thanks, Lisa. I'll shift to you, Mr. Tewari, and you've been the president of the Parliamentary Friendship Group for India and Australia, and we have heard n number of times that this relation, it's just been a decade. I've been studying this space for some time, and I think just a decade back, we could not imagine a pace at which the Australia-India bilateral relationship has grown. And if you have to think of three reasons, what led to this huge, speed at which this relationship is growing, what would that be? And how do you see the future trajectory of this relationship as well?
Well, thank you very much. May I commence by thanking Asia Society in Australia, the Ananta Centre, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade Australia, and of course the Ministry of External Affairs in India for hosting this 1.5 dialogue. And thank you very much for that brilliant question. But as lawyers say when they lay out a brief, let me make the highway points to provide context to the answer which I would then try and give to that question. See, as the Marxist philosopher Antonio Gramsci had said in the 1930s, that the old order is dead and the new one is struggling to be born. So we are really in the age of monsters. So the post-World War II order as we knew it is for the lack of a better word, really history. And nothing has yet emerged to really take its place. So therefore, are we then going back to the foundational precepts of the 17th century, which govern the conduct of nation states, primarily raison d'etre, coined by Cardinal Richelieu, or the balance of power of Hugo Grotius, which today in the global context is singularly missing? Because as you look around the world, there are, after the Second World War, 4 active and recessed conflicts which are playing themselves out. You have Russia and Ukraine now going back to the February of 2022. You have US, Israel versus the Hamas, versus the Houthis, versus the Hezbollah, and of course versus Iran now. And then of course you have had the India-China/Pakistan standoff since 2020. You've had the very wolf warrior rise of China since 2012. As President Xi Jinping said, that possibly you are in the throes of the Thucydides trap in the US-Chinese relationship. So therefore, you are looking at a completely changed or transformed landscape. Now, under these circumstances, when military power remains the single biggest element in complementing or in computing comprehensive national power, is there really space for the middle powers? That's the fundamental question today. China spends as much as 22 of the Asia-Pacific economies combined in defense. The US outspends China by 4 times. So therefore, that's the kind of strategic landscape that you're really looking at. And for the middle powers, it's now not an option. It is a question of survival. If you're not on the table, then you're going to be on the menu. And that's where the India-Australia convergence really comes in. And that convergence is that can India and Australia be those catalysts which can bring the middle powers together to act in synergy while simultaneously avoiding the armadillo syndrome, that your defensive knee-jerk reactions actually create more ambiguity and confusion rather than any coherent strategy. So yes, between India and Australia, as the relationship has developed, there are a lot of complementarities. Australia has a landmass which is 2.5 times the size of India. It has a population which is 1.97% of India. It has a median age which is 38 as compared to India's 28 years. So therefore, there is a lot of scope for the relationship to really develop and evolve bilaterally, of course. But the fundamental thing is, with the distracted United States of America, with the single largest outside balancer of power, not willing to perform the role that it had historically performed since the end of the Second World War, how do middle powers really try and find strategic space? And of course, in terms of strategic autonomy, as was rightly pointed out, that's been a lived reality with us now for 70 years. And I think that is where we should really focus on beyond the bilateral context in seeing as to how multilaterally and in a global context, Australia and India, which are uniquely positioned, are able to drive this conversation.
Thank you. And this is for all of you, and probably I'll ask Tim to kick off this conversation, but we are hearing the term middle power across this discussion. We are hearing the term trilateral, plurilateral, mini-lateral engagements. Tim, you have been a champion of Asia capability, and we've heard from the previous panel also that we have to think beyond just bilateral cooperation. We have to think of regional cooperation in this space now. There are already a few, besides the Quad, there are already a few existing trilateral platforms. We have the Australia, India, Indonesia trilateral platform, which is now been elevated to the level of the foreign ministers. Lisa mentioned about the supply chain resilience initiative, which was launched during the COVID times between Australia, India, and Japan, but has not seen much momentum. How do you see, Australia and India, as Manish was mentioning, creating that space for these kind of mini-laterals, which are already existing, but to properly kick off the ground or take an operational shape. And I mentioned the Australia, India, Indonesia spaces because we are talking about maritime security. We are talking about sea lane security. We're talking about securing global maritime supply chain routes. And I think these three countries, especially Indonesia, forms a key role in that. So how do you see these kind of platforms taking off?
Well, look, as all of the panelists up here have said, we are in unprecedented times at the moment. I think the official formulation we use in Australia is that many of the fundamental assumptions underpinning Australia's foreign policy in past decades are being challenged. So we have to find new ways of grappling with the increasingly complex and consequential world we face. My observation in the region is that all countries are confronting these challenges. They are seeking new relationships, new partnerships in order to confront these challenges. And, when I look across South Asia, Southeast Asia, Australia has struck new strategic and defence arrangements, unprecedented strategic and defence arrangements with Japan, Korea, Singapore, Indonesia, India. Talisman Sabre, our largest annual military exercise, had a record number of participants this year, India participating. So everyone is confronting this at the same time. I think Australia and India's efforts are aligned in many respects. We find ourselves facing the same agendas, pushing the same agendas in many of the same forums. As I say, maritime safety and security, Australia and India have worked closely together inside EORA for a long time, mirroring the work that we do in the Quad and bilaterally. So we're in a feeling out position at the moment, but I think our strategic outlook and our efforts are aligned. If I could build on the question, though, to Manish around how the relationship has come, the bilateral relationship Australia has come in the last 10 years, it's worth all of us just taking a step back, because I've been a member of Parliament for 13 years. 13 years ago, the relationship did not look like this room. We weren't having dialogues of this calibre or prominence. I was regularly travelling to India, I think pretty well every year since I've become a member of Parliament. Doors weren't flying open when Australians were coming to Delhi. People were friendly, but just weren't viewed as really mattering, I think. Now the relationship is one that's seen as having weight. The challenge that we have, though, is translating strategic alignment and leadership statements into operational reality. If I could use a metaphor that our Indian visitors will understand, I see the leader-to-leader relationship between Australia and India as a bit like Jay and Viru in Sholay. They're careering along in the sidecar motorcycle, yeah, dosti. Our victory is your victory. Our disappointment is your disappointment. Arm in arm, strong friendship. The rest of us are running to keep up. We have MEA, we have DFAT. How can we operationalise? Even further behind, we have business. How can we translate this shared alignment, this friendship into business relationships of trust and shared investment? I hope we get to critical minerals later, because I think that is going to be a fundamental new agenda for that relationship of trust in the business space.
Yeah, the very first closed-door panel is on critical minerals. But I think, Aparna, from what Tim said, and I completely resonate that feeling that, we develop a lot of agreements, but sometimes challenges come when we are trying to operationalize them on the ground. And you've been working in this space for a long time. Because we've been talking about perceptions. How do you understand how the other country operates? And I think you're best positioned here to sort of lay out some of the challenges which you come across when you're trying to operationalize a certain agreement that you have with Australia.
Thank you for that easy question. Can I make a few highway points, as Mr. Tewari put it very nicely? Look, the highway point is this. We have a sense that the US is an enduring presence here in this region. But if you actually look historically, it's only been in the last less than 100 years that we've had the superstructure of the US laws, ways of looking at the world. and normative order in this region. On the other hand, India and Australia have been here for much, much longer. We've evolved ways of looking at this region which are indigenous to us, to our needs, to the requirements of our common neighborhood. The answer to your operational question is not operational. The answer to your operational question is ideational, which is that we have to recognize that we are natural partners here. Once that recognition comes about is when the conversations become easier to take place. And we have to have those conversations because there is no alternative. In this region, we are looking at contestations not mainly of power transitions, of economic transitions, of technical transitions, of critical minerals. In all of these areas, these are existential questions that India and Australia face. So we need to have conversations with each other across various levels, which will allow us to have synergies and meeting grounds. And to your question that is, essentially you are saying that how long will we keep talking? When does the rubber hit the road? But talking in itself is an outcome. The fact that we are now having these conversations is what will open the way to those future more operational alignments. So let us not speed up to operational alignments before we have that framework, that grand norm together. Thanks.
Yeah, and I think that sort of also brings the value of such engagements that we are having at the moment. And Lisa, you also mentioned the entire middle power arms coming together. And if I have to, and after this I'll open the room for questions. And this is to all of you. If you have to think of a few key areas, besides critical minerals, of few key strategic areas where India and Australia can push that middle power diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific, what would that be?
Thank you, Premesha. I just want to pick up firstly on Aparna talking about ideating. I think that ideating only works when we have champions. And we've had, the first panel, we had a number of champions on stage. Tim, I have to say, is the champion for the Australia-India relationship in our parliament today. And there are others that obviously Tim has with him. In my time in the Australian Parliament in 2010, when I was first elected, finding that I was the first of Indian origin was daunting, but also made me go and look for champions. And those champions were some of you in this room, those in the business community, those in bureaucracy, and very much former High Commissioner Barry O'Farrell, who really drove what we now talk about as like it's always been there, which is the ECTA. And we're so much grateful for having that ECTA and being able to celebrate that we have a trading relationship today. I think it's something around 50 billion, which it was not anywhere near during my time in Parliament. Still got a way to go, though. I think Piyush Goyal wants it to be at 100. But it's certainly come a long way, and a lot of the champions are what made that happen. So moving from champions today, we now look at this issue of middle powers being Australia and India as champions for the whole region. I think one of the ways Australia has done that, again, during this time of change in terms of the hegemon position of the United States, is through sustaining the CPTPP after the US's withdrawal. I think for India, its current chairing of BRICS, which just occurred last week, and whilst they couldn't get to a joint statement, I think India used its middle power diplomacy to meet with, Jaishankar met with his Iranian counterpart on the issues of trade and those Indian flag vessels being able to get through the Strait of Hormuz. India continues to do that through its leader of the Global South, and that was on display when it was hosting the G20. Australia does it with its relationship with ASEAN. India also is now doing that with ASEAN, recognising that this is not just about the bilateral relationship, this is about two middle powers playing a leading role in the entire Indo-Pacific region, based on shared interests of an open rules-based order, wanting to keep that rules-based order alive, but also because we're trusting each other in ways that we never were in the past when we were on the opposite sides of the Cold War blocks. We are trusted partners today that can deliver so much more. And yes, our 1 million strong diaspora does, as Peter Varghese said in his economic strategy, need to play that bridging role in continuing to make that trust grow into something a lot more than the sum of its parts.
No, I just want to pick up on two things which Ambassador Green had said during his remarks and what Lisa just now referred to, and try and bring the two together. Ambassador Green very rightly outlined what, according to him, and correctly so, are the limits of the partnership. And the limits of the partnership is that Australia is still a treaty ally of the United States of America and a number of other such Western arrangements. And India, of course, historically, even going back to the days before its independence, when it convened the Asian Relations Conference in 1946, has always very strongly believed in strategic autonomy, trying to give that third way to the emerging nations of Asia, Africa, Latin America, and South America who were overthrowing the yoke of imperialism and colonialism. And Lisa talked about, preserving the rules-based order, which then brings you to a very fundamental question. Whose rules? Who made those rules? Who are the rule takers and who are the rule makers? And that fundamental equation has to be changed. No longer is the developing South willing to be a rule taker. We have to be, as middle powers, equal participants on that high table of diplomacy to reshape the world order as it stands destructed in the wake of what has happened over the past 1 decade. And there, Australia, India, even Japan, and other such middle powers in Europe and in South and Latin America have a very unique role to play, because there will be a new world order which will get crafted. What the shape of that new world order is going to be will have to be determined beginning now. Otherwise, for the foreseeable future, you would again be rule takers and not rule makers.
Thank you, Manish. And I'll open the floor to questions. Please introduce yourself and keep your questions short. It should just be questions or comments, brief. Prerna, go to.
Good morning. My name's Stuart Dunn. I'm an ex-defence officer and currently Director of AusPac Hydrospatial. And thanks very much for the invitation today. I've first got a statement. I think another common link between India and Australia is that we're both large ocean nations. We've sort of touched on some of the maritime initiatives. But certainly, this is a real link. The Indian Ocean touches Australia. The Indian Ocean touches India. That is a real common link. Now that I've said that, that's the naval officer in me. But a question to the panel. You've touched on the multilateral approach from both countries working within a rules-based order. But you've also said how chaotic the world is at the moment and the geopolitics surrounding it. The question that I've got is the multilateral approach now diluting any response and the outcomes from that? And do we need to take a harder option? And someone mentioned, being a champion within the region, but for real hard leadership. is it now time for India and Australia to stand up and show real leadership within the Indian Ocean and our India region? Thank you.
Can I just... Okay. Thank you so much. I'm Sharbani. I run strategic advisory for cross-border manufacturers, so essentially any manufacturer from Australia to India and vice versa. So you talked about rules, and I would love to unpack that a bit more, because rules also form behaviors. And when you look at Australia, and especially Australian manufacturers, it is a sector which is very well trenched with established behaviors. And one of the things is commercial behaviors of engaging with China. Now, China for Australian manufacturers forms a very trusted partner because it is a very predictive partner. They provide high quality manufacturing, and they also provide disciplined operations. Now, is there something that Australia, India can do, not just in strategic intent, but in operationalizing, which can actually translate or change this behavior? Thank you.
Sure. So, Indian Ocean region. Always love to have a maritime question. We sit here on the east coast of Australia, and traditionally, a lot of Australian attitudes have been shaped by the magnificent views you see from the east coast. But you grab a globe, and it's very, very obvious that Australia has very substantial interests in the Indian Ocean region. Half of Australian trade exports leave from Indian Ocean ports. Half of Australian naval assets are postured onto West Coast Indian Ocean naval facilities. We have one of the largest EEZs of Indian Ocean nations. We have one of the largest search and rescue zones in the Indian Ocean region. But the Indian Ocean region is a little bit different to the kinds of regions that we're used to moving in. And I draw that comparison between the Pacific Islands and Southeast Asia. So we're a Pacific Islands Forum member. We know how things are done in the Pacific Islands. There is a common outlook, and there are well-established patterns of cooperation and collaboration. Similarly, in ASEAN, we are not a member of ASEAN, but we are one of the earliest dialogue partners, strategic partners there. And again, there are habits of cooperation and collaboration that are well understood by all participants in ASEAN. You get to the Indian Ocean region, this is an extraordinarily diverse region. As an Australian representative at EORA ministerial meetings, I can remember looking around the table and seeing some of the participants and thinking, these are not countries that Australia is often in the room with, working directly with. Now, in that context, in some senses, I sort of view the Indian Ocean region as at the forefront of trends we're seeing elsewhere, and that it is a genuinely multipolar region. You know, it is a region where no country dominates. All countries need to work together in order to achieve outcomes. We believe that multilateral forums, regional forums, are really important in that respect. We invest a lot of effort into EORA, as does India. But we also invest in bilateral relationships to try and uplift the capability for Indian Ocean regions to exercise agency and sovereignty. You can see examples of that. Take the recent partnership between Australia and the Maldives and the gifting of the first Guardian-class patrol boat to the Maldives to help them to exercise sovereignty and agency in their maritime domain. So we try to partner with Indian Ocean countries. As High Commissioner Green says, it's a new focus for us in our national defence strategy, the Northeast Indian Ocean region. But the way we partner is trying to empower the agency and sovereignty of partners for Australia to work with.
Premesha, I was just going to respond to the multilateral question in terms of, the idea of choosing multilateralism or no multilateralism shouldn't be, a proposition. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. The question is, how can we strengthen multilateralism as it currently stands? Now, obviously, for Australia and India and Indonesia, Japan, we've all been going about that through trilaterals, through mini-laterals and the like. But fundamentally, as a multilateralist, I believe that we need to reform the system of the United Nations as it currently stands. And Australia has been very supportive in India's role in that reform, of India having a seat on the UN Security Council, for example. That should not disappear. And when we talk about, the other areas of contestation currently in this region being the Pacific, that United Nations General Assembly that happens each year is one of the most important platforms for Pacific Island countries, where they actually get their voices heard. We cannot take that significance of that and the power of that platform away. What we do need to do is recognise that times have changed since World War II, and it does need desperate reform and strengthening. As for where the rules are formed, that is where they're formed. That is where the rules-based order was created. But of course, it was led by the United States. And that diminution of the United States' role in the United Nations, the withdrawal of USAID, particularly in the Pacific, for example, and other areas, Africa and the like, is having absolutely detrimental effects on our region, but the globe as we know it. Those areas need to be addressed at the United Nations, and I really do sort of want to stress that yes, we do need to get on with all of the other issues that we can do at a bilateral, trilateral and mini-lateral level in the meantime, but we shouldn't do it at the expense of walking away from that larger multilateral system. We just need to reform it.
Just to take your question, last week you saw the summit between President Trump and President Xi Jinping. I have not seen President Trump behave so decently ever since he got elected. And that is an indicator of the current global dynamic. So therefore, here's the question. Would we like to replace the US-led rules-based order with a Chinese-based with a Chinese-led rules-based order? The West-led US rules-based order, will end up looking very benign compared to what might be coming. And so therefore, when I talk about whose rules and who were the rule makers and who were the rule takers, with great respect to Lisa, I would like to disagree with her. The rules were not made in the United Nations. They were made by a core of the United Nations called the P4 and not even the P5. And that is what significantly needs to reform, given that the context of global economic output and the entire strategic landscape has completely transformed itself since the end of the Second World War. And so therefore, while you talk about China being a trusted partner, China being a stable or a reliable supplier, the reason why most countries started looking at a China plus one strategy, because their experience during the days following the COVID-19 outbreak wasn't very pleasant. And I think it is important and instructive to reflect back upon that time and understand the nature of the beast that you're dealing with. And so therefore, while there may be stability and predictability, because totalitarian and authoritarian regimes are able to provide that much better, but when the push comes to the shove, things weren't very pleasant in terms of supply chains post or in the months immediately preceding COVID-19. And that's the lesson we need to keep in mind.
We'll just do one more round of questions, and I'll take a couple.
Sorry.
Yeah,
Before I've stepped in because thank you to my naval colleague there. Thank you for bringing up the maritime connection. That's actually one of the things I wanted to speak about, particularly in the context of the fact that Indian foreign policy is now pivoting to reclaim our maritime heritage. For a long time, we've been looking at ourselves as a continental power. But if you look at what has happened in the past decade, India is now investing billions of dollars into projects like the Sagarmala project, which is to build the ports and to build the connectivity with the hinterland with our ports. There is a vast area for collaboration here between India and Australia. The question often comes to the fact that while the trading priorities may be the same, the international law priorities may be slightly different. For instance, in the law of choke points, Australia speaks a lot about the freedom of navigation. We, on the other hand, see the importance of the humanitarian imperative. So the reason I speak about these specific questions is that we need to reach ways and means of talking to each other where we are able to understand each other's interests in particular areas. That being said, I particularly stepped in because I wanted to speak about your your statement that the international order or international organization or multilateralism is soft. Let me give you a personal anecdote. I've worked in our neighborhood, in India's neighborhood, and I've negotiated with our neighbors to the north and our neighbors to the west. And then I came to multilateral negotiations. And let me tell you this, I wished that bilateral negotiations could influence the hard negotiations in multilateral organizations. Multilateral organizations are not about doing good. Inherently, they are about the projection of power, about the protection of interests, about the creation of a world which is for the national interests of the 4 or the 5 people who are around the table when those rules are formed. So the question we have for Australia is that are you willing to come on with us on that table and perhaps to overlook or to the hierarchies of history, the problems of history, and look to the future and say in multilateral organizations, excuse me, what are the hard positions, are hard interests that India and Australia can take to progress our national interests individually, but in a manner that is mutually respectful to each other's needs. Thank you.
I've just been reflecting, listening to both of these contributions about Australia's history in the UN system. And, we championed the voices of smaller countries in the San Francisco conference. Doc Everett, that was, as the chair of that conference, that was his priority. But it's sort of been lost to the sands of time what the first ever referral of a matter to the UN Security Council was. Does anyone know what this was? This was the Australian government, the Chifley government, referring Indonesian independence to the UN Security Council, partnering with Indonesian nationalists. Indonesia chose Australia as its representative on the Council of Committee of Good Officers to navigate that. And Australians were the first UN peacekeepers supporting Indonesian independence. And a lot of that stemmed from the Asian Conference led by Pandit Nehru in Delhi and subsequently flowed through to the Bandung Conference. So there are multiple streams, I suppose, is what I'm saying here, and multiple ways that these multilateral institutions can be used, guided by the priorities and the interests of the countries participating in them. But Australia and India have a long history in this respect.
Thank you. And I think before we conclude this panel, I think I just want to add one. I don't think multilateralism is fading in any way, and I don't think India and Australia want that. The reason why minilateralism is picked up, probably it's faster to talk with a fewer countries who are interested in one specific issue to take it forward. Maybe that's the reason, but multilateralism will always, and you can see that in the joint statements that we come up with. Even if we mention those trilateral platforms, the word ASEAN centrality always finds a mention in all of those joint statements. So on that note, we conclude this panel and the conversation. And I think I speak for everybody in the room. It has been highly engaging. Thank you.